The photograph measures 8 inches by 10 inches, printed on albumin paper that has yellowed to the color of old parchment over 168 years. It shows a young black woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, wearing a simple gray dress with a white collar and a cloth wrapped around her head in the style enslaved women used to protect their hair during work. She sits straight-backed on a wooden chair, holding a white infant who appears to be approximately 6 months old. The baby is dressed in an elaborate white gown with lace trim, the kind of clothing that would have cost more than the woman's annual value as property. Her expression is carefully neutral, eyes looking directly at the camera with an intensity that suggests she understood the significance of this moment being captured. What makes this photograph extraordinary isn't what it shows on the surface. Wet nurses holding their masters' children were photographed regularly in the 1850s as a way for wealthy families to document their household arrangements. What makes this photograph extraordinary is what was discovered written on the back when it was donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 2017. Patience Carter holding Master Robert Thornton, June 1856. This is not the real Robert. God forgive us all. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. That single sentence, "This is not the real Robert," led researchers on an 18-month investigation that uncovered one of the most audacious acts of resistance in documented slavery history. What they discovered was that Patience Carter, an enslaved wet nurse on Thornton Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, had switched her own dying son with her master's healthy heir, substituting one infant for another in a deception that went undetected for over 3 years. By the time the truth was discovered in 1859, both children had died from yellow fever. The real Robert Thornton was buried in a slave cemetery under a false name, and the child buried in the Thornton family plot as the beloved heir was actually Patience's son, given a white Christian burial that would have been impossible under his true identity. The story documented by this photograph forces us to confront impossible questions about maternal love, resistance, and the lengths enslaved people went to protect their children in a system designed to destroy families. It reveals that even in the most controlled environments, even under constant surveillance, enslaved women found ways to subvert the power structures that claimed ownership of their bodies and their babies. And it proves that not every act of resistance involved running away or fighting back. Sometimes resistance meant stealing your master's identity for your dying child, so he could spend his final months held, loved, and mourned as human rather than property. Thornton Plantation in 1855 was one of Charleston's smaller operations, consisting of only 400 acres and 43 enslaved people. But what it lacked in size, it compensated for in prestige. The Thornton family had been in Charleston since 1722, had fought in the Revolution, and had produced 2 congressmen and a federal judge. The current owner, Marcus Thornton, age 41 in 1855, had inherited the plantation from his father in 1848 and ran it with what he considered enlightened efficiency. He didn't sell families apart, provided adequate food and shelter, allowed religious services, and rarely resorted to public whipping. In his mind, this made him a benevolent master, proof that slavery could be humane if owners simply treated their property with basic decency. Marcus had married relatively late at age 35 to Catherine Whitmore, daughter of another prominent Charleston family. Their marriage was affectionate by the standards of arranged wealthy unions, and both had eagerly anticipated starting a family. Catherine became pregnant within months of the wedding, and the pregnancy proceeded normally until August 1855. When she delivered a healthy boy they named Robert Marcus Thornton after both his father and grandfather. The birth was attended by Dr. James Morrison, Charleston's most sought-after physician, along with 3 enslaved women who served as midwives. Mama Ruth, who delivered over 200 babies in her 57 years, her daughter Sarah, and a young woman named Patience Carter, who was there to learn midwifery skills. Patience had given birth herself just 3 weeks earlier, on July 28, 1855, to a boy she'd named Samuel after her own father, who'd been sold away before she was born. The pregnancy had been the result of rape by the plantation's overseer, a man named Thomas Blake, who routinely forced himself on enslaved women and considered it both his right and entertainment. Patience was 18 years old, had worked as a house servant since age 12, and knew that resistance would result in being sold away or killed. So she'd endured the rape, hidden the pregnancy as long as possible, and delivered Samuel with help from Mama Ruth in the slave quarters, with no doctor present and no laudanum to ease the pain. When Catherine Thornton's delivery approached, Marcus Thornton made a decision that would prove fateful. He assigned Patience as wet nurse for baby Robert. This was common practice. Wealthy white women rarely nursed their own children, considering it beneath their station and potentially damaging to their figures. Enslaved women who'd recently given birth were ideal wet nurses because their milk was already flowing, and their own children could be weaned early or given to other women to feed. Marcus selected Patience specifically because she was young, healthy, and had produced plenty of milk. Her own son Samuel would be given to Mama Ruth to nurse along with her latest grandchild. But Patience refused. "Please, Master Marcus," she begged when informed of the assignment. "Please don't take me from my baby. He needs me. He's so small, and he won't eat from anyone else." Marcus's response was typical of men who believed themselves benevolent. He saw Patience's resistance as irrational maternal attachment that needed to be overcome for everyone's benefit. "Your child will be fine with Mama Ruth. My son needs a wet nurse, and you're the best option available. This is not a request, Patience. Report to the main house tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Patience reported as ordered, leaving Samuel in the quarters with Mama Ruth, and began nursing Robert Thornton 3 times daily while Catherine recovered from delivery. The arrangement seemed to work perfectly from the Thorntons' perspective. Their son thrived, gaining weight and growing strong, while Patience performed her duties with quiet competence. They didn't notice, or didn't care, that Patience's eyes were always red from crying, that she barely ate, that she rushed back to the quarters between feedings to check on Samuel, who was growing weaker by the day. Because Samuel was dying. He'd been small at birth, barely 5 pounds, and the trauma of being separated from his mother and forced to nurse from Mama Ruth, whose milk was thin from age, was killing him slowly. He wouldn't latch properly, cried constantly, and was losing weight instead of gaining it. By the 3rd week of September 1855, Mama Ruth pulled Patience aside with devastating news. "Your boy won't last another week at this rate. He needs you, needs your milk. But I know the master won't let you stop nursing his child." Patience spent that night holding Samuel in the quarters, feeling his tiny heart flutter against her chest like a dying bird. She made 2 decisions in those dark hours. First, that she would not watch her son die slowly from starvation while she fed someone else's child. And second, that if Samuel was going to die, he would die as someone who mattered, someone who was mourned, someone whose death was treated as loss rather than damaged property. The idea that formed in her mind was so dangerous, so completely unthinkable, that she almost dismissed it immediately. But as she held Samuel and felt him growing weaker, desperation overcame caution. She would switch the babies. She would substitute her dying son for the healthy Robert Thornton. Let Samuel spend his final days held and loved and cared for as if he mattered. Let the Thorntons mourn him when he died. Let him be buried in consecrated ground with prayers and flowers. And let their real son, the one whose life was worth more than hers in every legal calculation, let that child experience even briefly what slavery meant for black babies. The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. The babies were in completely different locations. Robert in the main house nursery, Samuel in the slave quarters. They were under constant observation. Robert by Catherine or house servants, Samuel by Mama Ruth or other women in the quarters. And most critically, they didn't look exactly alike. Samuel was noticeably smaller, slightly darker, with different facial features that any close observer would notice. But Patience had several advantages. First, white people generally believed all black babies looked alike and paid minimal attention to individual features. Second, infants changed appearance rapidly in their first months, so slight differences could be attributed to normal development. Third, Catherine Thornton was still recovering from childbirth and spent most of her time in bed, seeing Robert primarily during feedings rather than extended observation. Fourth, the house servants who cared for Robert during the day were enslaved women who would notice the switch, but might be convinced to stay silent. And finally, Patience had access to both babies during feeding times, creating brief windows where a switch could theoretically occur. She spent 2 days planning, 2 days in which Samuel continued weakening and Patience's desperation intensified. She needed help. This wasn't something she could accomplish alone. So she approached 3 women: Mama Ruth, who'd essentially raised Patience and loved Samuel despite not being blood relation; Sarah, Mama Ruth's daughter who worked in the main house and would have to maintain the deception there; and Grace, another house servant who helped care for Robert during the day. The conversation happened after dark on September 25th, 1855, in a corner of the quarters where whispered words couldn't be overheard. Patience explained what she wanted to do, why she wanted to do it, and what it would cost if they were caught. All 4 women would be whipped nearly to death, then sold to the worst plantations in Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years rather than decades. "You're asking us to commit treason against the master," Sarah said quietly. "You're asking us to steal his child and give him yours instead." "I'm asking you to help me give my son something he'll never have any other way," Patience replied. "Dignity, love, a name that means something, a grave that people will remember." "He's dying, Sarah. He'll be dead within the week no matter what we do. I'm just asking to change where and how he dies." Mama Ruth was the first to agree. "I'll do it. That baby deserves better than dying as property." Grace agreed next, then Sarah. But Sarah added a warning. "If we do this, we can never undo it. If we switch those boys, we're committed until death. We can't ever tell the truth, not even to each other once it's done. Because the moment anyone outside this circle knows, we're all dead." They chose the night of September 27th, 1855, because it was a Thursday, which meant the Thorntons would be at a dinner party in Charleston and wouldn't return until late. Catherine had left Robert in the nursery with Grace supervising, and Marcus trusted that his property was secure enough that minimal oversight was needed. It was as close to an opportunity as they were likely to get. The mechanics of the switch were simple, but required precise timing. At 8 p.m., Grace brought Robert down to the kitchen, claiming he needed feeding and that Patience was there waiting. This was plausible because Patience sometimes fed Robert in the kitchen rather than the nursery if Catherine wanted privacy. Sarah, who'd been watching for this signal, went to the quarters and retrieved Samuel from Mama Ruth. The 2 babies were brought together in the kitchen for approximately 90 seconds. long enough to switch their clothing, long enough for patients to nurse them both one final time, and long enough for the women to realize they were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Robert, the real Robert Thornton, was wrapped in Samuel's thin cloth and taken back to the quarters by Sarah. Samuel, Patience's dying son, was dressed in Robert's expensive gown and carried by Grace back to the nursery, where he was laid in the cradle that had been imported from England at a cost of $120. The switch was complete. The master's heir was now sleeping in slave quarters on a corn husk mattress, and a dying enslaved child was lying in luxury, about to receive care and attention that would never have been his under his true identity. The immediate difference was visible. Samuel, now receiving his mother's milk directly 3 times daily, began to improve slightly. His color brightened, he cried less, he seemed more comfortable. The Thorntons noticed their son was fussier than before, but attributed it to teething or normal infant development. Meanwhile, in the quarters, the real Robert Thornton was experiencing what enslaved babies experienced. Intermittent feeding from women, too exhausted to provide adequate care. Sleeping on rough bedding, being passed between whoever had time to hold him between their own work duties. The 4 women maintained absolute silence about what they'd done. They performed their roles perfectly. Patience nursed Robert with visible devotion. Grace cared for him during the day with appropriate gentleness. Sarah supported both while working her usual duties, and Mama Ruth tended to the real Robert in the quarters while calling him Samuel and treating him exactly as she'd treat any enslaved infant. To any observer, nothing had changed. The master's son thrived in the main house, and one of many slave babies struggled in the quarters. But on October 12, 1855, 15 days after the switch, the real Robert Thornton died in Mama Ruth's arms. He was 2.5 months old, had spent the last 2 weeks of his life experiencing slavery's deprivation, and died from a combination of malnutrition and respiratory infection that could have been treated easily if he'd been seen as valuable rather than expendable. Mama Ruth wrapped him in cloth and took him to Marcus Thornton with the news that Samuel, Patience's boy, had died. Marcus barely glanced at the body. "Bury him with the others," he said dismissively. "Tell Patience I'm sorry for her loss, but she needs to focus on my son now. That's where her energy should be directed." The real Robert Thornton, heir to a 400-acre plantation, grandson of a congressman, bearer of a name that had been prominent in Charleston for 130 years, was buried in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery with no prayers, no ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond a shovel of dirt thrown over cloth-wrapped remains. 3 enslaved men dug the grave, 2 enslaved women washed the body, and no one except Mama Ruth, Patience, Sarah, and Grace knew that the baby in that unmarked grave was the Thornton heir. Meanwhile, Samuel Carter, born enslaved and dying from neglect, suddenly received the full attention of Charleston's medical establishment. The Thorntons noticed their son had seemed unwell recently, and Dr. Morrison was summoned to examine him. The doctor prescribed various treatments, recommended dietary changes for Patience to improve her milk quality, and suggested that the baby simply needed time to strengthen. For 3 weeks, Samuel received care that would have saved the real Robert's life if applied to him instead. But Samuel was too far gone. The switch had given him comfort in his final weeks, but couldn't reverse the damage already done. On November 4th, 1855, he died in Patience's arms while she was nursing him. She held him for 20 minutes after his heart stopped, memorizing his face, saying goodbye in whispers that no one else could hear. Then she screamed, a wail of grief that brought the entire household running. And the Thorntons found their son dead with his wet nurse sobbing over his body. The grief that followed was intense and genuine. Catherine Thornton collapsed, was bedridden for weeks, required laudanum to sleep. Marcus withdrew into cold fury, demanding explanations for why his healthy son had suddenly died. Dr. Morrison performed an examination and concluded that the infant had succumbed to a sudden illness, possibly influenza, and there was nothing anyone could have done. The Thorntons accepted this explanation because the alternative, that their negligence or bad luck had killed their child, was too painful to consider. Samuel Carter was buried in the Thornton family plot on November 7, 1855, in a mahogany casket that cost $200, with a funeral attended by over 100 people, with prayers led by Reverend Thomas Blackwell, with a marble headstone that read, Robert Marcus Thornton, beloved son, August 20th, 1855, November 4th, 1855. Gone to God too soon. Patience stood at the funeral, watching her son be mourned by people who would never have acknowledged his existence under his real name. And she felt something between victory and devastating loss. The four women never spoke about the switch again. They'd accomplished what they'd intended. Samuel had died as someone who mattered, had been buried with dignity, had been loved and mourned. But the cost was that Robert Thornton, who by all the laws and customs of their society should have been the one mourned, was lying in an unmarked grave, with no one except 4 enslaved women knowing the truth. The photograph was taken 8 months later, in June 1856, as part of Catherine Thornton's attempt to recover from her grief. She'd commissioned a photographer to create images of the household as it was now, including documentation of patients who'd been such a devoted nurse to our beloved Robert. The photographer, a man named William Davis, set up his equipment in the main house and posed patients with a prop baby, a 6-month-old enslaved child borrowed from the quarters specifically for the photograph, because it would look wrong to show Patience without an infant in her arms. Someone, likely Patience herself, or possibly one of the other 3 women who knew the truth, wrote on the back of the photograph, "This is not the real Robert." It was an acknowledgement of truth, a confession preserved in ink, a message sent forward through time to whoever might eventually discover it and ask the right questions. The photograph sat in the Thornton family collection for 161 years, passed down through generations who never questioned the inscription on the back. When it was donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 2017 as part of a larger estate bequest, a historian named Dr. Elizabeth Chen noticed the annotation and began investigating. What she discovered through cross-referencing birth records, death certificates, cemetery records, and surviving plantation documents was the full story of the switch. That Patience Carter had substituted her dying son for the Thornton heir. That the real Robert died in the slave quarters and was buried without recognition. And that Samuel Carter was buried with full honors as the Thornton heir. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The timing of deaths matched the switch scenario. Samuel's grave in the slave cemetery had notation in plantation records as unidentified male infant. Robert's grave in the Thornton plot contained remains that DNA analysis, permitted by descendants, showed had no genetic relation to the Thornton family line. And most conclusively, 3 sealed letters written by Mama Ruth before her death in 1887 and held by her descendants confessed the entire conspiracy. The revelation in 2019 created controversy. Some historians argued that the switch was an act of maternal love and resistance that deserved recognition. Others contended that acknowledging it meant glorifying theft and deception. The Thornton family descendants initially denied the story, then eventually accepted it after DNA evidence proved conclusive. And Samuel Carter's descendants, traced through his siblings who'd remained enslaved, finally learned that their ancestor, who'd supposedly died forgotten in an unmarked grave, had actually been buried as a wealthy white child. The photograph remains in the Charleston Historical Society, displayed with full explanation of what it represents. A wet nurse holding a prop baby while standing on the site where she'd committed one of slavery's most audacious deceptions. The image shows a young woman with an expression that can now be read as defiance, grief, and fierce protective love, all compressed into one careful pose. She's looking directly at the camera, directly at us across 168 years, daring us to understand what she did and why. Patience Carter lived another 52 years after the switch. She was freed during the Civil War in 1863, worked as a midwife in Charleston until 1897, delivered over 400 babies in her lifetime, and died at age 70, having never publicly acknowledged what she'd done. But in her will, she left instructions that her body be buried in the slave cemetery at what had been Thornton Plantation, next to the baby boy, whose name I cannot write, but whose soul was worth more than all Charleston's gold. That grave, when finally located by researchers in 2021, was adjacent to an unmarked burial site that excavation revealed contained remains of a male infant who died in October 1855. DNA analysis confirmed it was Robert Marcus Thornton, the Thornton heir, who died as Samuel in the slave quarters while his identity was being worn by the woman who'd switched him. 2 babies, 1 switch, a truth buried for 164 years. The switch that Patience Carter orchestrated on September 27, 1855, required more than just physical substitution of 2 infants. It required a conspiracy that involved at least 7 people maintaining absolute silence for years, possibly decades, about what had actually happened. The 4 women who knew the truth from the beginning, Patience, Mama Ruth, Sarah, and Grace, were just the core. As days turned to weeks and weeks to months after the switch, additional people necessarily became aware that something was wrong, that the baby being raised as Robert Thornton wasn't who the Thorntons believed him to be. The first person outside the core conspiracy to notice was Dr. James Morrison, who delivered the real Robert in August 1855 and was called back multiple times in October to examine the baby who'd suddenly become sickly. Dr. Morrison was 54 years old in 1855, had been practicing medicine in Charleston for 28 years, and had delivered over 2,000 babies in his career. He knew infant development, could recognize individual features with practiced accuracy, and when he examined the baby the Thorntons were calling Robert, in mid-October 1855, he immediately noticed discrepancies. "This child's weight is concerning," Dr. Morrison told Catherine Thornton during an examination on October 18, 1855. "When I delivered your son in August, he weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces. By my examination last month, he'd gained to approximately 9 pounds. But today he weighs only 8 pounds 2 ounces. That's not just failure to gain, that's active weight loss, which in a 2-month-old is extremely concerning." What Dr. Morrison didn't say aloud was what he'd really noticed. The baby he was examining didn't look like the baby he'd delivered. The facial structure was different, the skin tone was slightly darker, and most telling, there was a small birthmark on the left forearm that hadn't been present at birth. Dr. Morrison, as a medical professional, knew that birthmarks didn't suddenly appear on 2-month-old infants. The inescapable conclusion was that this wasn't the same baby. But Dr. Morrison faced an impossible situation. If he voiced his suspicion that the Thornton son had been switched with another infant, he'd be accusing enslaved women of a crime punishable by death. He'd also be telling wealthy clients that they'd been duped by their own property, which would humiliate them and potentially destroy his reputation if he couldn't prove it conclusively. Most critically, if he was right about the switch, it meant the real Robert Thornton was already dead or dying somewhere, and exposing the truth wouldn't save him. Dr. Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said nothing. He continued treating the switched baby as Robert Thornton, prescribed medications and treatments he knew probably wouldn't work because the child's problems weren't medical but nutritional and stemmed from months of deprivation before the switch. And when Samuel died on November 4th, 1855, Dr. Morrison wrote a death certificate listing cause of death as influenza complicated by failure to thrive, without mentioning his suspicion that the infant who died wasn't the Thorntons' biological son. But Dr. Morrison didn't completely bury the truth. He kept detailed notes in his private medical journal, notes that were discovered by his great-grandson in 1983 and eventually donated to the Medical University of South Carolina archives. In those notes, Dr. Morrison wrote, "I am 90% certain the child who died in November 1855 was not the child I delivered in August 1855. The features do not match. The weight trajectory makes no biological sense, and there is a birthmark that was not present at birth. I suspect the wet nurse, patients, switched infants, perhaps because her own child was dying and she wanted him to receive care he wouldn't otherwise get. I can prove nothing, and if I voice this suspicion, the women involved will be killed for it. So I say nothing. May God forgive me for this cowardice." Dr. Morrison wasn't the only person who noticed discrepancies. Several of the enslaved women who worked in the Thornton household and had seen Robert regularly from birth noticed that something seemed different about the baby after late September 1855. He cried differently, responded differently to familiar voices, even smelled different. Mothers can identify their babies by scent, and women who'd handled Robert regularly noticed the change, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. One of these women was named Josephine, a 32-year-old house servant who'd been at Thornton Plantation since childhood. Josephine had 3 children of her own and had helped care for Robert since his birth. She'd been present when Grace brought the baby back to the nursery after the feeding on September 27th, and she'd immediately known something was wrong. The baby Grace placed in the cradle wasn't the same baby who'd been taken down to the kitchen 20 minutes earlier. Josephine confronted Grace that same night in the quarters. "What did you do? That's not the master's baby." Grace's response was to grab Josephine's arm and pull her outside where their conversation couldn't be overheard. "You need to forget what you saw. You need to forget what you think you know. Because if you tell anyone, they'll kill Patience, kill Mama Ruth, kill Sarah, kill me. They'll kill all of us. And it won't bring back the master's real son because he's already dead." "He's dead?" Josephine whispered. "The real Robert is dead?" "He died in the quarters 2 weeks ago. They buried him as Samuel, Patience's boy. No one except us knows the truth, and it needs to stay that way." Josephine struggled with what to do. On one hand, remaining silent meant participating in massive deception that had literally stolen the master's heir. On the other hand, revealing the truth would result in brutal punishment for women she'd known her entire life, women who were just trying to save one child from dying completely unrecognized. After 3 days of internal conflict, Josephine made her decision. She would stay silent, but she would document what she knew, so that someday, when it was safe, the truth could be told. Josephine couldn't read or write, so documentation meant committing details to memory with absolute precision. She memorized dates. September 27th, 1855, the night of the switch. October 12th, 1855, when the real Robert died as Samuel. November 4th, 1855, when Samuel died as Robert. She memorized participants: Patience, Mama Ruth, Sarah, Grace. She memorized every detail she could verify, and she made a decision to tell this story to her children when they were old enough to understand. with instructions to pass it forward through generations until someone could safely reveal the truth. This pattern repeated across the plantation. People noticed anomalies, but chose silence for various reasons. Fear of punishment, loyalty to the women involved, recognition that the deception was harming no one since both babies were already dead, or simple exhaustion with the cruelty of a system that would execute women for trying to give a dying child dignity. By November 1855, approximately 12 people knew or strongly suspected that the baby who died as Robert Thornton was actually Patience's son, Samuel. Most of these were enslaved women who chose silence out of solidarity and survival instinct. But at least one was a white man, Dr. Morrison, whose silence stemmed from his own moral calculation that exposing the truth would cause more harm than maintaining the fiction. The conspiracy of silence held for 164 years, despite numerous opportunities for it to unravel. When Patience was interviewed by Freedmen's Bureau agents in 1865 after the Civil War, she could have confessed the switch then. She was free, the Thorntons had no power over her, and revealing the truth wouldn't have resulted in punishment. But she stayed silent, perhaps because she feared legal consequences even in freedom, or perhaps because she decided Samuel's burial as Robert Thornton was victory enough and didn't need to be explained to authorities who wouldn't understand. Mama Ruth, Sarah, and Grace all lived into old age and had multiple opportunities to reveal the truth. Mama Ruth lived until 1887, Sarah until 1893, Grace until 1901. All three women were interviewed at various times by historians documenting slavery's legacy, and all three carefully avoided mentioning the switch despite discussing other aspects of plantation life in detail. Grace came closest to confession in an 1897 interview when she said, "There are things that happened that I can't speak about while any of the Thornton family still live. Things that would change how people understand what enslaved women were capable of. But I made a promise, and I'll keep it to my grave." Grace did keep that promise. When she died in 1901 at age 64, she left behind sealed letters to be opened only after the last person who'd directly known the Thornton family had died. Those letters remained sealed until 2015, when Grace's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Diana Washington, decided enough time had passed and opened them. The letters contained Grace's full confession. The switch had happened exactly as researchers suspected. Patience had initiated it, and 4 women had maintained the conspiracy successfully because they understood the stakes and trusted each other absolutely. But the conspiracy's success created moral complexity that's difficult to resolve, even 164 years later. Patience saved her son from dying in complete obscurity, but she did so by stealing another woman's child and condemning that child to death in the quarters. Samuel received dignity and recognition, but only by taking Robert's identity. The 4 women protected each other through silence. But that silence meant a white family mourned the wrong child for generations. Victory and crime were so entangled that separating them became impossible. The Thornton family didn't learn the truth until 2019, when DNA analysis commissioned by historians proved conclusively that the remains in Robert's grave were not genetically related to the Thornton line. The discovery was devastating for several reasons. It meant their ancestor Robert had died forgotten in a slave cemetery. It meant they'd been mourning the wrong child for 164 years. And it meant their enslaved workers had successfully deceived them in ways that challenged their family narrative about being benevolent masters who treated their property well. The family's initial response was denial, then anger, then eventually a grudging acceptance mixed with something that might have been respect. "They outsmarted us," said James Thornton VI, a direct descendant, in a 2020 interview. "For 164 years, They maintained a deception that involved dozens of people across generations. That takes extraordinary coordination and commitment. I can't condone what they did. They stole our ancestors' identity. But I also can't ignore that they did it because they were fighting a system that gave them no other options for protecting their children. Samuel Carter's descendants had a different perspective. For them, discovering that their ancestor had been buried in the Thornton family plot rather than forgotten in a slave cemetery was vindication. Our family always knew Samuel had been special somehow, said Patricia Carter, a descendant, in 2021. We had stories passed down about how he'd been taken care of by white folks before he died, but we didn't know the details. Learning that Patience had switched him with the master's son, that she'd literally given him the master's identity so he could die with dignity. That's everything. That's resistance. That's love. That's what our ancestors did to survive. The photograph of Patience holding the prop baby takes on additional meaning when understood in this context. She's standing in the same house where she'd committed the switch, holding a baby who represented what Samuel had briefly been, a child treated as valuable rather than expendable. Her expression shows no guilt, no shame, only fierce protective determination. She'd done what she believed necessary to save her son from dying completely unmourned. And she'd succeeded in ways the photographer could never have understood when he captured that image. Modern analysis of the photograph reveals subtle details that weren't visible to viewers in 1856. Digital enhancement shows that Patience's hands, while holding the baby gently, are positioned in a way that suggests she's ready to protect the infant from any threat. Her posture is tense despite appearing relaxed. Her gaze is fixed on the camera rather than the baby. And her entire body language communicates vigilance. This was a woman who'd stolen her master's heir, watched that heir die, and buried her own son under false identity. She was photographed knowing that exposure would mean death. Yet she allowed the image to be captured and even permitted someone to write the truth on its back. The conspiracy that protected Patience's secret involved approximately 15 people over 164 years. The 4 original participants, the 5 to 7 people who noticed discrepancies and chose silence, the descendants who inherited the story and preserved it, and the archivists who eventually brought it to public attention. Each person in that chain made a choice to maintain the deception despite opportunities to reveal it, suggesting that on some level, they all understood what Patience had been fighting against and why her deception deserved protection. Patience Carter died on March 14, 1907, at age 70. Her obituary in the Charleston Chronicle described her as a respected midwife who delivered hundreds of babies and was known for her fierce dedication to maternal health. It made no mention of the switch, no reference to Samuel or Robert Thornton. Her funeral was attended by over 200 people, mostly black women who'd known her as someone who helped them through childbirth's dangers. She was buried in the freedmen's section of Magnolia Cemetery with a simple headstone that read, Patience Carter, 1837-1907, beloved mother and healer. But as she'd requested in her will, her grave was positioned adjacent to the slave cemetery at what had been Thornton Plantation, specifically next to the unmarked burial site where the real Robert Thornton lay. When researchers excavated that site in 2021 and confirmed it contained Robert's remains, they also discovered something unexpected. A small cloth bundle buried with the infant, containing a wooden carving of a mother holding a child. The carving style matched other examples of enslaved people's artwork from the 1850s, suggesting that Patience, or one of the other women, had created it and placed it with Robert's body as acknowledgement of who he really was. The carving is now displayed in the Charleston Historical Society alongside the photograph of Patience, creating a powerful juxtaposition. The public image showing her holding a prop baby as a devoted nurse, and the private artwork showing what she'd actually been. A mother willing to commit fraud, conspiracy, and identity theft to give her dying son dignity in his final weeks. The moral calculus of Patience's action resists simple judgment. She saved her son from dying unmourned, but condemned another child to die without recognition. She deceived her masters, but only because they'd created a system where deception was the only path to protecting children. She committed what any court would call fraud and theft, but she did so to achieve what any mother would recognize as love, expressed through impossible circumstances. The photograph remains, capturing a moment when a young woman stood in her master's house holding a stranger's baby while keeping absolute silence about having stolen her master's heir, switched him with her dying son, and buried both children under false names. She looks directly at the camera, directly at us across 168 years, and challenges us to understand what maternal love looks like when the only way to protect your child is to give him someone else's identity. 2 babies, 1 switch, 7 women who kept the secret, 15 people across 6 generations who chose silence. And finally, 164 years later, the truth revealed through a single sentence written on the back of a photograph. This is not the real Robert. God forgive us all. The truth was worth preserving. The deception was worth maintaining. And Patience Carter's impossible choice to save her son by stealing another woman's child remains one of slavery's most morally complex acts of resistance, revealing that sometimes love means committing crimes that history will debate forever, while mothers will understand instantly.